So in this lecture, I want to set up the context for the nullification crisis that you'll be reading about. This is a period of incredible expansion and growth in the economy, but it's also a very volatile economy because what's really creating the volatility is the immense amount of land for people to settle, and then the speculation that's being put on this land in terms of loans given out by both the national bank, but more significantly even the state banks. So they're lending lots of money to settlers at certain interest rates. The land is in high demand, so prices are going up. And then suddenly something happens in the economy, much like it did to us in 2007, where suddenly people realize that these prices are way overinflated, the land's not worth as much as we have loaned on, and you see foreclosures just start this domino effect that lead to bank after bank within the states failing. And when you have failed banks, the economy starts to falter. And so that's what's happening. A lot of unemployment. You can see this is often considered the first Great Depression, if you want to put it that way. It wasn't as horrific in terms of length as the actual Great Depression of the 1930s, but it did create many of the same conditions that depression created. As you can see, as it says, it was the speculation depression, much like the speculation of our own Great Recession that we all just suffered through a few years ago. And what's going to happen here is nullification is going to highlight the sectional divisions that are starting to develop in America, most notably between North and South. Obviously, North and South are the two sides that are going to wage war against each other, but there's also now a sectionalism in the West. So the frontier of the United States, where this expansion is occurring, also develops its own sort of political identity. Just a map kind of to help you understand where this expansion is taking place in. In 1803, Thomas Jefferson obtained Louisiana, which is all this territory here. So now you can see many of these states have developed up to the Mississippi. We're now also starting to get states in beyond the Mississippi, in the Louisiana territory. And this is going to happen fairly rapidly. Every time one of these states wants to enter the Union, it's going to create, we want to maintain a balance between free states, slave states, so that one side doesn't dominate the Senate and possibly pass laws that are inimical to what the other side wants. So there's this, like Missouri is allowed in as a slave state, while Maine is brought in as a free state to create this balance. So this is what's happening. So the sectionalism North and South develops every time a new state is going to be carved out of this unorganized territory. And that's really what leads to the Civil War, is the expansion of slavery and the opposition to the expansion of slavery. So South Carolina is especially hard hit by the economic depression that's going on. And so that's going to help explain why nullification is such an issue for South Carolina. In the years following, a couple of years after the crisis hits in 1819, there's a huge panic in South Carolina. This enslaved man, Denmark Vesey, who had actually purchased his own freedom a few years earlier, is accused of starting a slave revolt in Charleston, South Carolina, and he and a few dozen slaves are rounded up, put in jail, and executed. In South Carolina, you have to understand there's more slaves than free whites in South Carolina. So free whites are actually a minority of the population in South Carolina. So they're constantly on guard and paranoid about slave uprisings There's a good chance we don't know for sure, but Denmark Vesey may very well have been accused wrongly and only confessed under extreme torture that he was putting together this slave revolt. So either way, what this incident really reveals is South Carolina's intense paranoia over the institution of slavery. It wants to maintain the system it has of oppressing its enslaved population for the good of their economy. And they see these tariffs now that we're going to talk about as an infringement on their state ability to govern themselves. And one of the arguments that's going to be made in favor of nullification is, well, hey, if the federal government can make laws that restrict our economic activity, what's to stop them from making laws that restrict the activity of us owning slaves? So slavery is going to be sort of in the background in the nullification crisis, but it's always there whenever you're talking about sectional relationships between North and South. Slavery is always there as one of the drivers. So in what becomes known as the Tariff of Abominations, the Tariff of 1828, for the North, they want to make these foreign goods more expensive by putting tariffs on them to create more sales of their own goods in the United States to make more money. So it's a pretty basic protection of northern industry. This is why the South doesn't like it, because it doesn't do much for the South. It's designed to protect the North. From the Southern perspective, it's creating, they have to spend more to buy foreign goods, right? Because now they're paying the tax, the tariff tax. So people are buying more U.S. goods, and European countries are going to respond by buying less Southern cotton, which is how the South maintains its economy. So this is going to basically force Southern farmers to buy European manufactured goods, even though they're too expensive. And so in either way, the economy of the southern states are going to suffer, whether they pay more for goods or buy more American goods and sell less cotton. So it's a lose-lose situation for the South, because South Carolina is still sort of suffering from the after effects of the Panic of 1819. It's going to hit South Carolina especially hard. So this is John Calhoun, and you'll be reading his argument against the tariff and in favor of nullification in this week. This is going to be a doctrine that he establishes, and it will be the doctrine used when the states secede eventually. And here's some background on the tariff. The tariff of 1824 had been bad for the South. The tariff of 1828 was even worse. And then we are going to try and get some compromise with the tariff of 1832. However, South Carolina is still not going to like that, and they're going to issue a statement basically threatening violent secession, to which Jackson is going to respond, and you'll be reading those documents. So the threat of nullification, and John C. Calhoun is really seen as the father of this nullification doctrine, in which he claims that the states have the right to cancel any federal laws they consider unconstitutional. Obviously, it's an extreme states' rights position, and like I said, it's really important because it's going to be the doctrine the states use in 1860 and 1861 when they secede from the Union and lead to the Civil War. After the Tariff of 1828, in the Congress, there's a debate between Robert Hayne from South Carolina and Daniel Webster, the famous senator from Massachusetts. Hayne argues in favor of states' rights and nullification. Webster makes the argument that the Constitution is an agreement between the people, not the states, and thus nullification is void as a doctrine. Again, this is the debate that in some ways still goes on today, right? The debate between state power and federal power, but obviously it's also the debate at the heart of secession and the Civil War. This threat made by the South is strongly opposed by Andrew Jackson, a bit ironically because he was such a states' rights advocate. But he basically threatens to send the army to South Carolina in order to collect the tariff. And in the face of this, South Carolina backs down. In the meantime, however, they're putting together a compromise, the Compromise of 1833. Henry Clay, working with Andrew Jackson, decide they can lower the tariff gradually over 10 years. In exchange, South Carolina drops its idea of nullification. And in exchange to that, Jackson drops the bill he wanted passed to allow him to use force. This essentially avoided the Civil War for the time being. Another thing, South Carolina had attempted to get other southern states who were hurt by the tariff to join them in this nullification threat of secession. No other states really wanted to join South Carolina at that time, but they will in 1860.